When it arrived, it was the best phone, bar none, that the world had ever seen. It was a massive upgrade to the emerging concept of the smartphone, and all at once, it was something more. A handheld supercomputer that broke countless boundaries of innovation, miniaturization, and all-round person-focused utility. It was a cultural phenomenon, one that would usher in revolutions in every sphere, from finance to entertainment to the justice system to a long series of very real revolutions around the world. It was an invention so ubiquitous, so widely regarded, that we'd be willing to bet that there's at least one within a 5-meter radius of you right now. It was, and it is, the iPhone. Quite possibly the single greatest retail product of the 21st century. When you hear about a project undertaken by Apple during the 2000s, most people will automatically assume that the project was the brainchild of one Steve Jobs, the eccentric business magnate and inventor who sat atop the corporation's pyramid until he passed away in 2011. But the iPhone wasn't Steve Jobs' concept to begin with. Instead, it belonged to a French software engineer named Jean-Marie Hullot, who worked for a company that Apple acquired in 1996 called Next Step. Hullot was a renowned expert in informatics, which is a discipline that deals with how information is processed and how humans interact with that information. As part of Hullot's prior work, he had been instrumental in creating the touch-sensitive surfaces that the iPhone and so many other modern technologies depend on. And on Apple, he was using that expertise to make the interface for Macintosh computers user-friendly and accessible. Hullot was one of Steve Jobs' more trusted allies at Apple, and though the Frenchman had left Apple and returned to Paris after his work on the Mac, he continued to receive calls from Jobs asking for assistance in regenerating Apple's creative spirit. Put more directly, Jobs wanted Hullot to return to California and resume his work. Although Hullot refused, he did propose another idea. He wanted to make a telephone in Apple's distinctive style, one that would open up a whole new realm of technology for the company and improve on the badly ailing technology that already existed. Though our younger viewers might not have known it, smartphone technology was by no means a new thing when the iPhone eventually burst onto the space. The first smartphone was actually announced by IBM a full 15 years before the iPhone went on sale. Known as the Simon Personal Communicator, the IBM device used a rudimentary touchscreen and a stylus, although its 1-hour battery life made it only minimally useful in practice. With the Simon had come mobile apps, calendars, address books, calculators, email, and more. In 1997, Nokia put the first game onto a mobile device, and the Sharp company added the first camera in the year 2000. Internet access came a year later. But all things considered, smartphone technology was not anywhere near the level it would need to be in order for it to be actually useful. Applications were clunky and buggy, there were few user interfaces that could even be considered decent, and the cost of data was super expensive. But even despite the state of the smartphone industry at this time, Hullot had trouble convincing Jobs to take him up on the idea. Eventually, Jobs relented. Hullot would get a small team to assist him in Paris, where they would work in secret with only minimal interest from the big boss and see what, if anything, they could get done. But Jobs made no secret of the fact that he was against the concept from day one, largely because he disdained the idea of having to work with telecoms companies like Verizon and AT&T, who were known for imposing their own stringent requirements for device manufacturers around what their devices could or could not include. In Paris, Hullot's team continued, though undeterred, knowing that convincing Jobs of the validity of their idea would be a lot easier once they had something that they could show him. They went back to Hullot's bread and butter, the touchscreen, with the goal of creating a surface that could allow users to communicate with a tablet or even a phone screen using their fingertips instead of a stylus, keyboard, or click wheel. To experiment with the technology, Hullot's team first jury-rigged a prototype about the size of a table, trying to figure out how to make it work well enough that Jobs simply wouldn't laugh them out of the room. But the team also needed an intermediary, someone who knew how to get the idea through Jobs' head in order to secure further funding and technical support. The person they went to was one Jonathan Ive, a British engineer and future knight who had been Apple's design chief since 1997. Ive was immediately taken by the concept and attempted to use his considerable personal influence with Jobs to explain the product, but yet again, Jobs dismissed the project out of hand, or at least he did so for a little while. With time to think on the matter, Jobs started to warm up to the idea, and the project continued at Apple without any additional trouble. But the idea of a smartphone remained on the back burner until 2005, when Jobs began to get nervous about the evolutions that Apple was starting to see from their competitor companies. Although smartphones still weren't what Apple would eventually transform them into, they were beginning to be developed with more and more storage capacity, which presented Apple with a major problem: music. At this time, Apple basically had a monopoly on personal portable digital music players with its line of iPods, but if these other companies could put music players into their cell phones, then they had a very real chance of killing the product that made up 45% of Apple's revenues. For a company like Apple, which stressed its principles of sleek efficiency at every turn, it was unthinkable to ask consumers to carry two music players in their pocket at once, and they knew full well that if one of those music players had all the bells and whistles of an early smartphone and the other one didn't, then there would be no contest. Jobs and his company had watched the same problem eat the digital camera industry alive once cell phones had been equipped with cameras of their own. And without major innovation, the iPod risked falling into the same redundancy and obsolescence. Jobs' early attempts to deal with the issue led to a fairly busted product known as the Rocker, and a bit of an ugly bastard of Apple's iPod and Motorola's Razr cell phone, but this kind of partnership with another company was anathema to Apple, and the Rocker proved it. Partly out of frustration with that failed experiment, and partly out of frustration with just how inefficient yet insanely complex most smartphones were at the time, Jobs and his executives decided to go it alone. After all, if there was one thing the world agreed on, it was that people would like a better cell phone than any company was currently churning out. Apple had met that same demand with the iPod, and if they had their way, they were going to do it again. Early in the iPhone program, the biggest question at Apple was about which team would design the product. Jobs' first choice, a team that was working on the airport wireless space, was chosen on the A to B logic that since the iPhone would be wireless, the airport people's experience with wireless products would be enough to get the job done. But the airport and its technologies bore exceptionally little actual resemblance to a phone of any kind, so before long the iPhone initiative was reassigned to the team working on the iPod under an engineer named Tony Fadell. Under his leadership, an effort known as Project Purple kicked off, a secret and highly guarded attempt to revolutionize the entire smartphone industry. The iPod team's early attempts were rudimentary at best. At the time, iPods ran using a track wheel, which was all well and good for scrolling up and down lists, but really bad at doing things like, say, dialing phone numbers. While Fadell and his team might not have been thinking this far ahead, we can only imagine how bad a track wheel would be for writing an email. So, as much as the iPod team might have tried to gaslight themselves into believing a track wheel might work, they eventually had to admit defeat. And this is where we return to Jean-Marie Hullot and his team over in Paris. Although Hullot and his 4 top engineers were not interested in returning to California, so disinterested in fact that they'd all resigned from the company, technology was the perfect antidote to the iPod team's problems. Their touchscreen project had been mostly directed toward building a tablet-sized product, which we now know as the iPad, but it solved every problem of the track wheel and more. It was about this time that Steve Jobs himself went to a dinner party, one that would have profound consequences on the entire tech world. At the party, which was for a Microsoft engineer's 50th birthday, said engineer decided that it would be a great idea to brag to Jobs about Microsoft's own developing tablet, one that used a stylus and one that the engineer promised was going to run Apple out of business. In Jobs' own words, as quoted in his biography, "As soon as you have a stylus, you're dead." This dinner was like the 10th time he talked to me about it, and I was so sick of it that I came home and said, "F this, let's show him what a tablet can really be." The next day, Jobs expressed his desire to his team that he wanted a so-called multi-touch design for his future tablet or phone, a touchscreen that could handle multiple inputs at once, the kind you'd get from, say, fingers and not a stylus. According to Jonathan Ive, the multi-touch technology Jobs wanted was already well on its way, courtesy of the Paris team, and when engineering lead Tony Fadell saw the technology, he too understood just how potentially groundbreaking it could be. Apple began work on 2 tracks. One team, led by Fadell, would try and make a phone using the track wheel concept, and the other, led by engineer Scott Forstall, went to work on the multi-touch design. Engineers were recruited in secret for both teams, many of them being pulled off their existing work for a project they were told would be extremely demanding, but for which they received no details until they committed, which they'd often have to do within just hours or they'd lose the opportunity to somebody else. The design process kicked off and immediately entered a round-the-clock cycle of toil and tension that would continue for 2.5 years. During those years, the group's facilities became overwhelmed with trash and dirty laundry. Workers were pulling extremely long hours, and to hear some tell it after the fact, they were forced to choose the iPhone over their marriages. But in this crucible, the team at Apple put together a masterwork. Within about 6 months, Jobs and the team conceded that the riskier, unproven multi-touch option far exceeded anything that the track wheel could do, and they focused fully on the multi-touch design. Despite the popularity of the BlackBerry phones of the day, Jobs was determined not to include a keyboard for the iPhone and insisted that the team develop software to project the keyboard onto the phone screen instead. It was this insistence that led to the eventual result featured in the iPhone: specialized keyboards for typewriter-style written composition or dialing phone numbers, as well as compartmented keyboards for special characters and the ability to adapt the simple interface into global languages. From there came the phone's display, where the team had to deal with problems like the phone's touchscreen being activated while bouncing around in people's pockets. While things like a butt dial or unintentionally playing loud music aren't unheard of with the iPhone, they were made much more rare with the phone's swipe-to-open system. It also had to learn how to tell an ear or a cheek apart from a finger, so that holding the iPhone up to listen to a call wouldn't end up sending an incoherent text to one's boss. Application screens were made navigable with swipes and prods from a finger. The phone's home screen was made to feature Jobs' beloved rounded rectangles for its app icons. As important as the software, though, was the design of the phone itself. Although the iPods of the day used a plastic screen, the team wanted to try something a bit more elegant for the iPhone and looked into the possibility of developing a glass that was strong enough and flexible enough to resist scratches or breakage. To find the glass they needed, Apple went to a company called Corning Glass, whose CEO, Wendell Weeks, explained to Jobs and his team that he had just the glass for their situation. Developed in the 1960s, it was an exceptionally strong composite known as Gorilla Glass, but it had never found a buyer before Apple. Despite Weeks' protest that Corning didn't have the capacity to mass-produce Gorilla Glass anytime soon, he got a characteristic talking to from Steve Jobs directly, something to the effect of,
"If you believed in yourself, you'll mass-produce this glass."
Despite a presentation that generally seemed somewhat detached from reality, this approach had served Jobs well in the past, and it did here again. A Corning facility in Kentucky was converted quickly to making Gorilla Glass, and well, the rest is history. Just as important on the hardware list was making a device that was tightly sealed and couldn't be opened. Jobs had always been personally against the idea of people taking apart and modding his computers, and he sure as hell wasn't about to allow it for the iPhone. The phone was designed in a way so it could not be opened, even for a battery replacement, forcing the phone to accept a rechargeable lithium-ion battery, not a replaceable one. This change also allowed the iPhone to be exceptionally thin, a proudly recurring design element for Apple's products. Like many of Jobs' projects, the iPhone was subject to last-minute changes, the most prominent of which was a revision to its outer aluminium casing. Despite the fact that it had been the culmination of 9 months of effort, Jobs and Jonathan Ive both felt that the case was obtrusive and took away from a relaxed, effortless focus on the screen. The iPhone wasn't supposed to be a taskmaster. It was supposed to be a companion. To hear Jobs tell it, he was forced to ask his entire team to go for a redesign. He said, "Guys, you've killed yourselves over this design for the last 5 months, but we're going to change it. We're all going to have to work nights and weekends, and if you want, we can hand out some of the guns so that you can kill us now." Luckily for Jobs, his team wasn't feeling particularly murderous that day, and although the redesign required the circuit board's processor and antenna to all be significantly altered, they got it done, giving the phone the thin, almost invisible edge that was iconic in its day. The iPhone was first shown to a Time magazine writer named Lev Grossman, who immediately understood why the phone had been designed the way it had. Although it included a range of clear improvements and innovations, it wasn't really an exercise in inventing new technologies. Instead, it was a beautifully crafted assembly of technologies, tools, interfaces, and design principles that already existed, but that nobody had yet had the sense to put together in a way that revolved so clearly around the user experience. When the iPhone was unveiled in January 2007, Jobs described it another way. Today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products of this class. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. He repeated the list, and then he asked the crowd, "Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we're calling it iPhone." When the iPhone hit the market at the end of June 2007, it was a resounding success around the world. Priced at $499 and $599 upon launch, roughly the equivalent of $700 and $850 today respectively, the iPhone was sold in 4 and 8 gigabyte options. Despite challenges with the launch, specifically due to Apple's exclusive contract with AT&T as a service provider, the iPhone nonetheless sold somewhere around 500,000 copies in just its first weekend on the market. Within a few months, the 8GB phone was made standard, and it was dropped substantially in price, and although it was treated with some skepticism early on from critics, before long, it had been named Time magazine's 2007 Invention of the Year. The iPod Touch and the iPad would come shortly afterward, providing valuable expansions on the iPhone's utility while keeping the core traits that had made it so popular. In many ways, the iPhone's greatest success was its status as a triumph of human-centered design, a principle that Apple had excelled in applying for years, but one that the iPhone really took to the next level. The phone's entire design process was focused on stripping out anything that a person might find overly complicated, hard to understand, ugly, or unnecessary. But even beyond that, it was focused on ensuring that the replacement to any of those features would not be just better, but intuitive for a user. While it's functionally impossible to build a device that's intuitive to anyone, and if you don't believe us, just hand a touchscreen phone to an elderly aunt or uncle who's still got their rabbit ears on the television, the iPhone was nonetheless incredibly easy to use compared to any alternative of the time. Another, perhaps more elemental innovation of the iPhone was the degree to which it allowed for software to change the device as time went on. As opposed to previous smartphones, which had to work around substantial amounts of unchangeable physical hardware, the iPhone's hardware features were remarkably few in number. A power button, 2 buttons to adjust volume, a switch to turn off your ringer, a charging port, and a home button, and a headphone jack, both of which have since been removed. Quite literally, everything else the phone can do, it does because of software, meaning that software updates can profoundly change the phone at Apple's will, up to and including its entire user interface. This sort of flexibility has allowed iPhone-style smartphones to sprint through updates, while previously companies would have had to churn out entirely new devices to implement those changes. The iPhone did have its fair share of problems, both in its first few months and in the years since that time, from controversies to technology issues to some very real and concerning labor issues with Apple supplier Foxconn. But aside from the labor concerns, it's difficult, on balance, to even justify spending time going through the iPhone's failings when compared to the overall magnitude of its impact on the world. Over 2.3 billion units have been sold since 2007, and it accounts for a truly massive proportion of Apple's revenues even today. At present, it commands over 27% of the smartphone market around the world, and over 50% in North America. And even today, its influence is continuing to grow among young users, in a clear sign that the brand's best days might still lie ahead. As we write this in 2023, the latest version of the iPhone is its 14 series, and every version of the device, every software update, and every other little tweak have continued to make the phone better and better and better. We could write a long list of global changes that the iPhone brought about, but in the interest of time, let's present some highlights. The widespread availability of handheld computers with the ability to take photos, transmit large amounts of data, and use social media simultaneously directly precipitated popular uprisings like the Arab Spring and sparked a reckoning in many countries around the criminal justice system and policing. It made news accessible at a moment's notice, not just world-shaking global events, but intimate, personal news as well. It kicked off the formation of a modern gig economy, formed the bedrock for remote work, and made web access itself more accessible in all corners of the world. The world of dating and romance received a massive, if polarizing, update with apps like Tinder, and the taxicab and city bus were made obsolete by Uber, Lyft, and other rideshare functions that allow users to find a ride wherever they go. It replaced flashlights, alarms, calculators, notebooks, webcams, e-readers, and in-person banking. And on a broader scale, the iPhone's emphasis on third-party applications kicked off a revolution in app and software development, one that has made companies, social media giants, games, and a whole lot else become functionally ubiquitous. All in all, the iPhone is one of the biggest global game changers ever. A revolution, a supercomputer, and a lifeline to the entire world. All in one. From an early concept that seemed dead on arrival, even with the man who would later release it, to a masterwork of simple, functional engineering, to a proven and dominant force on the world stage, the iPhone has carved out a permanent place for itself in history. What comes next is hard to say. But if anything can knock the iPhone off its throne, then whatever that anything is, well, it's going to have to be incredible.